Welcome everybody to the 7-County Witch Hunt Project podcast edition. This is a 6-part mini-series under the auspices of the Folklore podcast, but very much definitely not a folklore podcast project in terms of its content. I am merely your guide on this journey through the next 6 episodes, looking at the research, the work, and the information that came out of the running of the 7-County Witch Hunt Project. In a moment we will explain more about what that is and why it's not an actual witch hunt for those who responded to the initial social media messages and went, "Ooh, are you hunting witches?" Kind of, but not in that way. So, joining me to explain all about their project, because this was their project and not mine, are Professor Marion Gibson and Dr. Tabitha Stanmore. We will first have you introduce yourselves to people so that they can get a handle on which one of you is which and what you do. And Marion, let's start with you.
Hello, I'm Marion Gibson and I led the 7-County Witch Hunt Project. It was funded 3 years ago by the Leverhulme Trust, to whom we're very, very grateful for funding our project. And I've been writing about witches for 30 years or so.
Hello, yes, I'm Tabitha Stanmore and I am the postdoctoral researcher on the 7-County Witch Hunt Project. My specialism is, if anybody has seen my Twitter handle, mostly practical magic in late medieval and early modern England. So this is a bit of a pivot into witchcraft and the persecution of that magic. But yeah, kind of very interested in the stories and the real life experiences of people in the past and how magic and witchcraft featured so strongly in their lives.
And you are both past guests of this podcast in one way or another, and since then so much has happened. Marion, you've been touring the world with your latest book. You, Tabitha, won the Catherine Briggs Award this year with your book. So I think we're well placed to get some good, hard information out of this little collective here about the project and about the history of witchcraft as it relates to the 7 counties. Eagle-eared listeners will be sitting thinking, well, it sounds like you're sitting in a cafe and not in a studio. And indeed, we are sitting in a cafe. So we are in a cafe at the University of Exeter, the base for a lot of this work, because we want to have that kind of informal chat type atmosphere around us. We don't want this to be a kind of academic, dry presentation. Academically rigorous, yes. Dry, most definitely not. So let's start at the very beginning with a bit of an overview then as to what the 7-County Witch Hunt Project was all about.
So we applied for the money 4 or 5 years ago now to undertake a 3-year project which would survey all the records that we could find from the communities visited by the Witchfinders Matthew Hopkins and John Stearne and the people who worked with them in a big witch hunt that happened across 7-ish counties in eastern and central England in 1645 to 6, so in the middle of the Civil Wars. And we wanted to go and look at those records because we realised that scholars had not had the time, the funding, the digital access that we have now and hadn't been able to look at all that breadth of records before. So we wanted to go back and see what was there, what had been missed, what extra information we could find out about the people of the hunt, and particularly those who were accused or those who were ordinary accusers. So people who weren't witch finders in any sort of, professional or famous sense of the word, but just ordinary people, because we've realised that there are an awful lot of records of ordinary people out there from the past that haven't really been looked at or haven't been thought about as contributing to the stories of witch finding and witch trials. So that was the impetus behind the project, and that was why we went to the Leverhulme Trust and asked if they would give us money to look at England's mass witch hunt again.
And what sort of form did this research take? Are we looking at a lot of kind of archival exploration here? Are we looking at the depths of old papers and trying to unpick the vagaries of secretary hand and all of those sorts of things.
Oh yeah, all of that, yes. Yes, and that's been absolutely brilliant. So we've been to so many different archives. We have been to all the county record offices and a good number of other repositories, the National Archives, the British Library, various museums and local history and records centres. We've really tried to go everywhere and look at everything, and it's been really, really tiring and really huge. And we haven't succeeded, even now, in looking at everything. There will still be stuff out there, and this is one of the reasons why I want to kind of welcome people into the project. It's kind of your project too. If you live in these communities, if you work in these repositories, and you know that there's stuff that we haven't seen, you know that there's stuff out there, please tell us about it. Please dig it out. We think there's still material out there, but we have spent 3 years very conscientiously looking at every repository we can think of where there might be a record of somebody who was either accused or was an accuser or was somehow involved in the big witch hunt.
These are very much stories of ordinary people, which is kind of the focus of this first episode. So looking at the kind of methodology that you use in digging out these stories, but also the stories themselves, those individual stories of individual people and why those stories are important. But to what extent do we still have those records? Because these are the people who had no voice at the time, and this is something when we look at witchcraft histories we come across all the time, and we're perhaps restoring that voice to those people in lots of different ways. But how scant is that information, do you think?
I think it's actually, there's more of it than I expected, which is actually a very encouraging place to be. I think, well, as Marion says, it was a very ambitious project to start with. Roughly 300 people were accused of witchcraft in this witch hunt. About roughly 100 of those were executed, and you have to multiply their accusers by 3 or 4 times when you're sort of looking at the number of people we're trying to track down. So for some people, there isn't anything that survives. There are some individuals who we don't even have a name for. It just says in Matthew Hopkins' Discovery of Witchcraft, Discovery of Witches, that several people were found in the village of Over and they were executed for witchcraft. And that's all it says. And we don't have any surviving record for them at all. But for other people, we can read against the grain to find out a lot about their past and their histories. So one of the things that we've been working with a lot is parish records, and just being able to piece together the kind of the wider family tree of the people who were accused, and sometimes the accusers as well. Sometimes you'll notice that they lived right next door to each other, or that they were related to each other distantly, and that kind of thing. And giving that extra context is really, really important for piecing together these stories. So even when the records are really scant, there's definitely more to discover than I thought we might find, which is a nice place to be.
Explain a little bit about how this came about, what inspired this research in the first place, because sometimes these ideas come out of nowhere, sometimes they come out of a small discussion in a coffee shop like we are now, sometimes they come out of something bigger. In this particular case, what inspired it? Does it relate to one particular story? Does it relate to a range of stories?
It actually goes back a very long time in history, my history, I suppose, because I've always had this almost non-academic desire to know more about these people. The first time I read a witchcraft pamphlet was actually in this very building, come to think of it, and I sat down one afternoon and read a pamphlet called A True and Just Record, which was about some people who were accused of witchcraft in the village of St Osyth and various other Essex villages in the 1580s. And I just wanted to know more about them. I wanted to know why these people were telling the stories of magic that they did. I wanted to know more about the lives of them. Most of them were women, and I realised I knew very little about the lives of ordinary women in the past. And I was just entranced by the idea that I could find out more from these stories of witch trials about what those people's lives were like. And, I wanted to know what they had for breakfast. I wanted to know how they did the washing. I wanted to know their relationships with their children and their families and their wider community. I wanted to know how they earned money. I wanted to know, when they went to sleep at night, what did it sound like outside their house? What did it feel like on the mattress they were laying on? I wanted to know all of that stuff. And just this kind of itch has persisted over the years of wanting to know more about people. And it felt like this big witch hunt was a kind of pinnacle of complexity and hugeness, and would give us a massive sample of these people that we could find out more about. So it was a very ambitious thing to do. And I think there's a lot more work to be done in this area because there are so many people involved. But I think we found out a good amount about people whose lives would otherwise be almost unknown. And I don't like that. I don't like that sense of these people just being forgotten or just being thought of as a statistic, like Tabitha was saying, a certain number of people were accused in a village and we don't really care about those people because, we're hearing from the witch hunter about those people and they literally did not care what happened to those people. They didn't care who they were before they'd accused them of witchcraft, and they didn't care that they were going to die at the end of this process or their lives would be unutterably ruined. And I wanted to care about them and I wanted to tell their stories and I wanted other people to hear their stories and be able to contribute what they might know about that locality or about what happened. So that was the impetus, really. It was a sort of emotional impetus more than anything else.
I think also, just to add to that, I think that one of the major things that bothered us both was actually that a lot of these people were being boiled down to stereotypes in the pamphlets and in the way that they've been sort of treated afterwards. A lot of the people who are accused, including Elizabeth Clark, who I know you've done a lot of work with, Marion, she was an individual. She was a person who had her own experiences and had a very sort of difficult life story, which maybe you could talk more about. But the way that she's presented by Hopkins is as the very stereotypical witch, somebody who is older, vulnerable, difficult, just a wayward woman in many ways. And she was obviously so much more than that. But that's, going into these records and going beyond those pamphlet stereotypes, I think is a really, really important aspect of this project. These people have been brought to life for me in a way that they definitely wouldn't have been if I hadn't been able to sort of touch the records of their own sort of birth records or their children's birth records and that kind of thing.
It's a brilliant thing, that, isn't it? And Elizabeth Clark, Bess Clark, is a really good example. We found out as part of the work for this project and its inception that actually she was much younger than people had thought in the past. She was young enough to have an illegitimate child in the few years before she was accused of witchcraft. So the idea that people often write about her as an old crone or an old hag, and these are horrible stereotypes. Of course, a lot of people who were accused of witchcraft were older. A lot of them were older women. That's important to remember. But in each case, an individual was involved. And with Bess, she's a disabled single mother. She's a quite different person to the one we've heard so much about in history. And, I found records of the birth of her child and its baptism. I found out who she said the father was. I found out more about the way she was treated in her community and her relationship with the church people in her community. And not only did it explain more about why she was accused, which was really helpful, but it actually, I think, gave her back a sense of her life, of her being, before somebody pointed the finger at her and called her a witch. She was more than that. And that was also really helpful in sort of lighting up the fire under this project of making us think, right, if we can do it for Bess Clark, can we do it for other people?
There are a lot of stereotypes, obviously, when we look at the subject matter of witchcraft in history. And there are a lot of stereotypes today, let's be honest. Some things never change, do they? But there are certainly a lot of stereotypes, and they come from lots of different places, as you say. So, we can look at the historical record and we can see where broomsticks get involved, and we can see the influence that art history and literature has on the figure of the witch. And then in modern times, we can look at film references and see the influence of Margaret Hamilton on these sorts of things. But when you're looking purely at archival records, at written sources, to what extent has this project been able to fill in the gaps that we had before, perhaps relating to witches as a figure, to the history of these kinds of accusations and the treatment by people like Hopkins and Stearne, I guess?
I think it changes the historiography and understanding of who witches were, because one of the things that's interested me is how varied and different these people are. And once you start picking away at the detail of their lives, you also, I think, notice more the obvious things about them, like their gender. You think, oh, hang on, there are actually more men involved here than I thought, potentially. And there are more younger people. And there are people with more interesting life histories, which go beyond the kind of simple narrative that people often have about witchcraft. Somebody came to the door, they asked for some charitable relief, they were refused, they were turned away, they went away mumbling, and later something horrible happened in the household that they'd visited, and they were accused of having caused it by witchcraft. And that's really important. That did happen a lot. In that sense, the stereotype is true. But I think the diversity of the people involved is really important, and the detail of what happened. Sometimes it's not people asking for charity, it's people having a row about something else, which is quite complex and quite localised. Or it's people not asking for something to be given to them, but actually trying to barter something or trying to get employment or something like that. And I think the more we pick away at the detail of these kind of accusations, the more we can ask good questions in other cases about who we think that the people were.
I think also it's something about the standing they have in their community is something that we've discovered a lot more about. Being able to dig into the records, find other records attached to their lives. You find all sorts of interesting things, like, for example, some of the men who were accused, and even some of the women, were involved in previous cases that were sort of seen in court, not as accusers, but as witnesses. And the fact that they were able to give witness testimony suggests that they were seen as trustworthy enough or established enough in their community to be used in that way. And that's really important. It means that it's not just that this person was always an outsider and was always rejected. Like, something must have happened in their lives to change their status. And again, that just means it's not just this one moment in history where somebody, as you say, mumbles, and that means that they're a witch. No. There's much longer story here. And they would often have pre-existing relationships with the people that they were accused of harming. And sometimes there was very good reason for them to have had a falling out, and recognizing that these are humans, they're messy, they've had long-standing disputes, and sometimes these result in a witch accusation. It brings more colour, I suppose, to the stories, and means that it's not just hysteria. I think that's another thing that's coming through here. It is people in communities clashing, and there are reasons for that, and sometimes it is just because they are very, very stressed during the Civil War and, kind of trying to find an explanation for things. But other times it is because something has come to a head that's been brewing for 10, 20, 30 years even.
Gender is one of the biggest stereotypes, and we'll come to that in a later episode and explore that in a lot more detail. But what strikes me as quite interesting here is that there's a big focus in a lot of what you're talking about and a lot of your findings on normal, everyday disputes, communities, interactions with each other, and everybody gets annoyed with their neighbour at some point or another. And today's civil court boundary dispute was the kind of witchcraft accusation of a few hundred years ago, perhaps. But I wonder, with a particular kind of emphasis on your work, Tabitha, and your explorations of cunning folk and the kind of more practical, magical elements of these histories, to what extent are some of the people that you've looked at in this project put into that category as actually being kind of, I hesitate to use the word practitioners, but, healers, folk medicine users, those kinds of things? And to what extent are they just these ordinary community disputes that you're describing?
So a bit of context about the project before I go into this. Marion and I split up the counties between us. So I got Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire, always hard to remember the final one. And Marion was working with Essex, Norfolk and Suffolk. And so when I'm talking about this, I'm very much talking about the things that I know. And so, Marion, please jump in and tell me if there are examples of this from your side. But I was actually surprised at how little cunning folk and practical sort of benevolent magic featured in these trials. Everybody that I found was being accused of some kind of harmful magic and normally some sort of diabolism. It's not that they were sort of well known as village healers. It was more that they were just normal everyday people. One of them's a blacksmith, one's a miller. Most of them keep pigs of some kind. A lot of them just sort of subsist on the common. And that wasn't seen as a bad thing at the time. Sort of commoning was a very sort of established part of Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire life. And they just seem to be normal people who also have had fallings out with people, and as a result have had a reputation for working with the devil, or potentially they're descended from a known witch. That happens quite a lot. What exactly is meant by
millers,
that?
Though, two of the most supernaturally charged jobs that you could possibly have in this area, sure.
True, but they're not getting in trouble because of their blacksmithing. I think that's the important part.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but I was surprised by that. I expected there to be more other kinds of magic involved. And I found cases that pre-exist this witch hunt in the 1640s, cases from the 1630s or kind of the early 1640s, where, you do have somebody accused of witchcraft, and then somebody goes to a cunning man and says, can you confirm this is in fact witchcraft? And, within the same area 10 years before, that seems relatively common. But by the time you get to the 1645 to 7 period, cunning folk just aren't really mentioned in the same way. I think there was only one that I found who was mentioned in these trials, which is very unusual.
Yeah, it is, and I agree. I think there's something special about this hunt, because the work that I've done before, particularly around the St Osyth case, which I wrote a book about a couple of years ago, that one, there was lots of evidence of cunning people. There were cunning people arguing with each other. There were cunning people throwing accusations at each other. People were confessing to being cunning people and saying exactly what kind of spells and charms they were using. They were service magicians. That was what they did, some of them. But there's far less of that. And I think that might have something to do with the circumstances of the trial. Maybe magic has become, this is just me kind of, speculating here, but maybe magic has become less important as a background to all of this because there's so much else for people to be worried about at the time. There's a civil war going on. These communities are hugely stressed. You've only got to look at something like church wardens' accounts and you can see how much money people are pouring into the war effort, and how obviously that money is therefore not going into other community services like poor relief. So there are a whole range of really serious practical concerns. People's lives are hugely disrupted in this era. I wonder if maybe they're thinking more about the non-magical stuff in their lives. I don't know. But also, I think people like Hopkins and Stearne are driving this concern with diabolism. I think they're going from one community to another, taking with them this idea that the heart of witchcraft is nothing to do with healing magic or anything that these people are actually doing already in their lives. No, it's to do with devil worship. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking to purify their country. They're looking to advance the cause of one of the sides in the Civil War, which is the more puritanical one. I think this is some sort of project of national purification for them. And I think that they go around spreading the ideas about devil worship and suckling familiars, and being kind of demonic anti-Christian church. And that really influences the whole tenor of people's confessions, I think. Because what they're doing, that also has not been done, I think, with such vigour before, is they're essentially torturing their suspects. They're watching them for night after night. Some people are watched for 3 nights, 4 nights. They're not allowed to sleep. They're herded up and down the room which they're in. They're kept in stress positions. And naturally enough, at some point, they're going to fall in with a crazy story that the witchfinders have brought to them, which is that, 20 years ago they met the devil and they made a pact with him, and the devil was in the form of a dog, and they suckle the dog and they give the dog their blood and their soul, and the devil dog gives them power, and therefore they are Satan worshippers. So I think this witch hunt feels different to all the ones I've looked at before, in that actually cunning magic plays less of a role, which is surprising. I also expected to find more, because that was what I'd seen before. But I actually think this time there's something different. This is far more politicised. This is far more a hunt for heretics, if you like, and political subversives and nuisances, than it is for magical practitioners and medical practitioners.
So from the side of the witch hunters, it's very much a politically driven exercise, and from the side of the communities who are sometimes accusing each other or sometimes just falling foul of circumstance, then with a lot of supernaturally based histories, it comes about because of everyday tensions, fears of death, fears of disease, fears of war, all of those sorts of things. What it never really comes about because of is anything particularly magically driven. Is that a fair assessment or an unfair assessment, Tabitha?
I'm a big believer in magic as a driving force in history. I do think that it should be more present, I think, in our interpretations than it sometimes is. Because these people weren't being accused of treason, they weren't being accused of heresy. There's a reason they were being accused of witchcraft. And I think that is because, there was a genuine belief that this was possible, and that it was a threat to communities. And I do think that, that diabolism element that Marion was talking about is really important, because it was in the middle of the Civil War. There were reports every single day of the devil walking abroad and people allying themselves with them, and not just sort of everyday people, like the actual king allying himself with the devil. So this idea that maybe there is the devil in your community able to disrupt things, I think is a very, very powerful motivator of fear, but also something which made sense to the people living in these communities. And especially when you then have, Matthew Hopkins turning up in his big hat and his big cloak, saying, yes, you're absolutely right to be worried about this. Let me help you identify who the diabolical creatures are in your community. So I don't think we should take that away from these trials. Because it was rational and coherent for people to be worrying about that. But there are clearly pressure points and triggers which have pushed that too far, which always happens in witch hunts, right? It's always that sort of, there's too much fear building up, and combined with genuine belief, that's where we start getting these really dark stories.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think magic is a huge driving force in history, and I think it still is today. The amount of irrationality and what people have come to think of as magical thinking in contemporary life ought, I think, to alert us to that factor in the past as well.
Nothing in history says power more than a big hat. Yeah. You've looked at various sources, various archives as part of this project. You looked at different types of records, official records, maybe more unofficial records. What's given you the best insight into the history that you've been exploring?
We agree on this, don't we?
I think so, yeah.
It's parish registers, which are one of the most obvious sources for historians to look at. And, lots of you may be family historians or local historians, and you may think, of course, it's parish registers. But sometimes professional historians don't think that. And I think the profession has sometimes overlooked things like parish registers in the past. There's been a lot of focus on records of public bodies and political and economic records and taxes, and all of those things are really important, of course. But sometimes it's just things like family connections. It's whether somebody's recently had a child and whether somebody's recently lost a child, and whether their husband has died and they've remarried and they've fallen out with their sister-in-law. And you wouldn't know any of those relationships if you didn't look at parish registers. And they're just brilliant to look at as well. I just love them so much. They're so various. And I think when you look at them, you not only get the detail of those relationships, which can help you reconstruct why a witchcraft accusation happens in the way that it does, why X is accused by Y. You actually see the texture of the community in them. And you see gaps in them where something bad has happened. Maybe the minister has died and they've not been replaced for a number of years, and there's a vacuum at the heart of the community. Church life is not going as it should, and that's what happens in Manningtree at the start of the witch hunt in Essex. Or you can see, that the minister's not doing his job so well, that he doesn't seem to care that much about his parishioners, and sometimes he's not recording things that you want him to record, or his parish clerks are not recording things that you would want them to record. They're not recording the names of the mothers of children, for example. Or, in a particular case I was looking at in the last few days, they're not recording the names of brides. So you've literally got a series of marriages where it's, John Smith married blank. And that went on for that went on for about 4 years in this particular community that I was looking at. And that tells you everything you need to know about the place of women in such a society. There's literally a blank space where the name of the wife should be. That was her wedding day. And we don't even know who she was now. So I think those kind of things are really revealing. Parish registers are really revealing of what's going on in a community for a whole range of reasons, which are not just to do with data about who's married to who and, who is the mother of whom.
I think also they're excellent for producing the trail of breadcrumbs that you need to find other things. So, for example, obviously a lot of the people who are accused of witchcraft were women. And so, you often only have their married name, for example. So you don't know what their maiden name was and what connections they had beyond their married life. And so, but if you can track that down in the parish registers, then you can find out so much more about them and open up a whole new opportunity to find other sources like other trial records or tax records and that kind of thing. So one case that I'm completely obsessed with is the case of Bridget Bonham, who married a man called John, like John Bonham, like not the drummer from Led Zeppelin, but clearly the namesake. So Bridget Bonham, that was her married name, but before that she was a Westland. And the Westland family was a really big family in her community, and they were troublemakers. And because I know her surname, her maiden surname, I was able to discover that her mother was accused of witchcraft when Bridget was 9, and Bridget actually ended up going to prison with her mother to await trial. And her mother was eventually acquitted, and they both went home to their community. But I wouldn't have known that she had that witchcraft genealogy in her life if it weren't for the fact that the parish registers gave you that insight to start with.
I'd like to wrap up this first episode with one final question before we move on to the rest of this series and the meat of this project. And that's to ask you whether, coming out of the end of this project now, you find that your understanding of this period of history has been changed as a result of what you've discovered. And also, as an extension of that, perhaps whether you hope that this project and this series is going to change the views of those who are listening about this period of history too.
That would be nice. I think that I have learned a tremendous amount about this period. I'd previously written mostly about Elizabethan and Jacobean cases, and I was kind of frightened of this period actually, because there's a massive civil war going on. It's really politically and religiously complicated, and I was thinking, oh God, I'm going to have to know, the names of these 9 different sects and exactly, what's going on in Parliament and who's accusing who of what in political circles. And it turned out it wasn't as frightening as I thought it might have been, and that really what you need to know about the period is just how disruptive it is. I think living in the times that we do has helped, actually, because that sense of generalised dislocation and breakdown that I think a lot of us are experiencing at the moment actually applies really, really nicely to the mid-17th century as well. So I felt more empowered to look at that history, and I hope that might translate to other people feeling empowered to go and look at that history too. You don't need to know about ranters and levellers. You don't need to know about Presbyterians and Anabaptists. You need to have a vague idea of what they're all up to. But actually, if you look at the community level, the feeling of dislocation and disempowerment is probably the most important thing, the generalised high levels of anxiety that people are feeling. So maybe it might empower people to feel a bit more confident with histories of very difficult times, possibly. It's maybe a bit early to say. We haven't quite finished yet, and I feel like there's a lot to mull over. And I'm writing a book about the cases that I've looked at, and I still feel there's more to learn, there's more to think about, with the idea in mind that this particular witch hunt fits in an unusual way into the history of English, British witch hunting, and there's probably more to say about that.
Yeah.
What about you, Tabitha? Has it changed your understanding, your views?
Yes. I've always been very invested in individual stories anyway, but I think it has made me much more emotionally connected to this history. Just because it isn't just a pamphlet. It's not just sort of one person's opinion being filtered via a clerk, via a publisher, and then it's not looking at the result of basically entertainment literature. It's looking at individual people's lives and being able to see them a little bit more in 3D. And I think that is really important. I think that so much of our understanding of witchcraft does get boiled down to those stereotypes, and that makes me very sad because it's much more complicated than that. So I think it's thrown the period into relief much more than I expected it to. And I think also it has shown that this witch hunt is much more complicated than just two men appearing in a village and torturing people. There is so much more going on in the individual communities. And even, we discussed the kind of people who were targeted. It's not who you'd expect. And I think that's really important to recognise as well.
Yeah, I'd like people to go away from this feeling exactly that sense of emotional connection and ownership. If you sort of de-academicise it, if you like, and you throw the research open to a wider group of people, and those people can feel like they own this. This is the history of their communities. This is their history. I think that's really valuable. And if you can feel that emotional connection to it, that's so empowering. And that gives you a reason to do the research, and it gives you a reason to care about these people. I think if we have the sense that these are real people and that this could have happened to us, which I also think is really important, that's a really powerful insight. It maybe helps us think about our own times as well as the mid-17th century.
So there we are. We're all set and ready to take this path through the next 5 episodes, and we will see whether we change people's understandings of this period of history or people's views on Matthew Hopkins, the period of witch hunts in the counties that we're looking at, and how we have added to this overall base of knowledge. In the meantime, you can find the 7 County Witch Hunt Project on Blue Sky in the show notes for this episode of the podcast. You can find links to that, links to the blog where you'll be able to get in touch and interact with Marion and Tabitha. Coming up next in episode 2, we'll turn to the accusations of which we speak and unpick a little bit more about what these people, who we will term for now witches and maybe revisit later on, were actually accused of. I hope you can join us all for that. In the meantime, Marion, Tabitha, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.